But I want to talk about Dave Meltzer. And thanks, by the way, to the guy who literally copied my tweet about this word for word and posted it as his own on Reddit. Someone sent me a screenshot of it. You're welcome. I don't want to beat up on Dave too much. You know, the Observer for many years was the source of pro wrestling news. If you were a fan who wanted to know about the goings-on behind the scenes, and obviously if you were a talent too, because they would pass this thing around all the time. You hear stories about it, and guys would try to hide it when they were in the locker room, but, you know, everybody was reading it. I don't get too hung up on the star rating stuff the way some people do. But it was always the Observer and the Torch. Keller's been doing this since '87. Meltzer for even longer than that. Those old Observers are a helpful resource to have, especially for historical content. Unfortunately, there are not many wrestling archives as detailed and readily accessible as those old Observers, because the wrestling news, reporting bubble, it just isn't very big. It's bigger now than it used to be, for sure. But back in the day, you had the magazines, many of which were kayfabed, and you had the dirt sheets. Hulk Hogan even burned a copy of the Observer on a WCW pay-per-view once. And there is still good information in those newsletters. I think it's unfair to dismiss everything the man says these days as nonsense, because that's become kind of the in thing to do. But it's weeks like this that make it hard not to see why people feel that way. I don't know what the fuck happened this week. He's still clinging to this notion that Rock against Roman was locked in for this year's WrestleMania as far back as the beginning of January, yet in the same breath, he admits that he has no answer as to why they had Cody Rhodes win the Royal Rumble if the plan was always for The Rock to wrestle Roman Reigns. Because it wasn't the plan until Rock suddenly wanted it to be. That's why it doesn't make sense. Rock decided he wanted to do the Roman Reigns match now, and it blew everything up. Thankfully, he had enough sense to course correct. But then Dave went completely off the deep end, and he put something in this week's newsletter. It just defies all logic. And it has since been edited out. It's been deleted. But he wrote, and I quote, "At the Mania press conference on February 8th in Las Vegas, Levesque talked about guys going into business for themselves with the idea that Rock was going against the planned script. Later, they filmed a segment which did not air on television but was all over social media where Levesque and Rock went nose to nose and actually challenged each other for a match at Mania, although it was that they would love to wrestle each other before a giant crowd at a WrestleMania without the idea that it was this specific one. Given Levesque's heart issues, such a match would seem to be impossible, and virtually everyone believed that to be the case." Reading that, I thought that I had totally lost my mind, because I don't recall anything like that happening. I saw the same segment that you did at the end of that press conference, where they had a run-in backstage, and Rock told him to fix things, and if he didn't fix things, he and Roman were going to fix it for him. But nowhere did they come nose to nose and challenge each other to a match at WrestleMania, but that did seem awfully familiar to me. And the reason it sounded awfully familiar to me is because it sounded a lot like a segment the two of them had, which did air on SmackDown, 10 years ago. Actually, they filmed it at Raw in Brooklyn that week. That was the night that Rock confronted Rusev and Lana. And then they aired it on SmackDown. I think it was the 15th anniversary that week. That was the first tease they did for a possible WrestleMania match between them. And then at WrestleMania the following year, they had The Rock and Ronda Rousey confronting Triple H and Stephanie with the idea that they might do either a mixed tag or they might do Rock against Triple H in Dallas the following year, but it never happened. So how in God's name did Meltzer mistake a segment from 2014 as something from 2024? You would think the 2K15 poster on the wall behind them would have been a dead giveaway. Like, how does that happen? We're not talking about a typo. Typos I understand. I mean, this guy is writing 40,000 words every single week. I can understand a typo. But this is not that. How does that happen? How does this man not have an editor to catch things like this? I mean, this is still not as bad as doctors taking Shibata's brain out of his skull and putting it back in. But it's pretty damn close. Next week, he's going to be telling us that Triple H was miraculously cleared for a match with The Rock, but he couldn't understand why they did it on SmackDown, and why Shawn Michaels superkicked Rock in the face, and seems to have grown his hair back in. But that wasn't the only thing this week. I mean, that was bad enough. If it was just one thing, all right, whatever, you want to chalk it up to a bad day. He reported that Tommy Dreamer was the new head of TNA Creative after Anthem fired Scott D'Amore. Within hours, this was refuted by Dreamer himself on Busted Open, and by Mike Johnson on PW Insider, and I'll have more on that later. He reported that as part of Tony Khan's deal with CMLL, no other Mexican wrestlers, regardless of whether they're affiliated with AAA or not, because CMLL and AAA, they don't play nice together, that no other Mexican wrestlers can appear on the same show. But if that were true, they already violated their own agreement on the very first show that the CMLL stars appeared on. Because the night that we first saw them storm the ring was the night that Commander, who's a AAA guy, wrestled Wardlow. Fightful Select, when they asked about this, they said they got pushback on that report. Yeah, no shit. I'm sure they did. From people within AEW. Because it's understood, like CMLL and AAA talent, they say, cannot be booked against each other. That would probably start World War III. But what Dave said in that report, it just doesn't make any sense. He reported last week that the morale backstage in AEW was the best that it's been in a long time. But then this week he said that while he did report that, there's actually a lot of frustration over people flying in for these shows and then not being used because they have so many people on the roster. So I guess morale, maybe the high morale only lasted 1 week, I guess. It isn't just the case where, maybe with the new regime at WWE, he doesn't have the same sources he once did. That may be true. That may be true, but we're not just talking about WWE here. He got things wrong with AEW and with TNA, all in the same week. He had to apologize last year for reporting false information about Dragon Gate that he claimed was a hoax that came from a couple of people who didn't actually work for Dragon Gate or who were pretending to be somebody that they weren't. This went on for an entire year. At least he fessed up to it and he said it wouldn't happen again. But that was embarrassing. But the worst of all is he again repeated falsely in this week's Observer that Ashley Massaro, in her email to WWE after the concussion lawsuit got dismissed, apologized to WWE for the things she said. That is just demonstrably false. I read the email, okay? It takes 5 seconds to look up the email because WWE shared it publicly a few years ago after her death. What she apologized to them for was allowing herself to be poached by her attorney to be part of the concussion lawsuit, and that she should have consulted with them first before agreeing to be part of it. To read what Dave writes makes it sound like she apologized to them for everything she said in her affidavit, which includes the story about her being raped and WWE wanting her to keep quiet about it. That is absolutely nowhere to be found in that email. And I think that's a pretty important distinction to make. But I'm not a journalist. I'm just a podcaster here, so what do I know? It's one thing for Dave to be wrong about a creative plan or Shibata's brain. I'm worried about Dave's brain. I don't know if it's that he's overworked or a laziness to double and triple check things or just an outright refusal to accept reality. But he's been doing this long enough that he should know better.